Modern History of the Arab Countries. Vladimir Borisovich Lutsky 1969. Chapter IX Lebanon, Syria and Palestine in the period of the Tanzimat 1840-70. The Arab countries in the world capitalist market. The British intervention and Muhammad Ali's capitulation in 1840 marked the beginning of a new period in the history of the Arab countries, a period when foreign capital was rapidly gaining ground. This period may be considered the beginning of the colonial and economic enslavement of the Arab countries. It culminated in the conversion of the Arab countries into colonies, a process that took place in the next historical stage during the formation and domination of monopoly capital. The application of the Anglo-Turkish Trade Treaty of 1838 to Egypt and Syria gave British goods and those of other capitalist countries access to the Arab markets. Between 1840 and 1850, imports to the Ottoman Empire of British goods alone increased almost threefold, from £1,440,000 to £3,762,000. The inflow of European goods resulted in the decline of the old industrial centers, and the ruin of handicrafts and the domestic industries. It also impeded the development of the national manufactories, which were unable to withstand the competition of European factory production. At the same time, the development of foreign trade led to the rise of trading cities and the strengthening of the comprador bourgeoisie. It also stimulated the growth of the means of communication, the building of the Suez Canal, a port at Alexandria and a road between Beirut and Damascus. Under pressure from foreign capital, farming in the Arab countries began to assume a commodity character. It began specializing in the production of a small number of commodity crops. In Egypt this was cotton and sugar cane, in Syria and Palestine it was cotton, cereals and wool, and in the Lebanon raw silk. The development of commodity production, however, did not lead to the establishment of capitalist relations. The peasant became dependent on the world capitalist market and at the same time retained his dependence on the feudal lord. The Arab countries were incorporated in the world capitalist market as an agricultural and raw material appendage to European industry. Economic relations were based on unequal exchange, which in itself was a sign of the exploitation of the Arab countries by industrial capital. In 1856, foreign capital began to enslave the Arab countries by the export of capital, mainly in the form of loans to Egypt and Turkey and the construction of means of communication. Herifgulhane. Signs of the new were appearing in Turkey itself. A small strata of national bourgeoisie, as yet mainly commercial, had come into being. Feudal relations in the village were collapsing. A movement for national liberation was growing in the Turkish-ruled Balkan provinces, where the development of capitalist relations had begun earlier than in Turkey. Greece and Serbia had actually fallen away from the Ottoman Empire. To prevent the complete collapse of the empire and the fall of the Sultan's authority, the more far-sighted members of the feudal and bureaucratic ruling class set to work to draw up a new plan of reforms. They realized that the reforms of Mahmud II alone could not save the empire and that new, resolute changes were needed. The initiator of the new reforms was Reshid Pasha, liberal minister for foreign affairs and Westerner. His program was a modest one. It did not endanger the feudal mode of production and fully preserved the absolute power of the Sultan. In effect, it was an attempt at compromise between the outlived feudal theocratic monarchy of the Sultan, on the one hand, and the growing commercial bourgeoisie and the liberal-minded landowners, on the other. Based, as it was, on the interests of the ruling class, it reflected to a considerable extent the aspirations of the Turkish bourgeois elements. The defeat of the Turks by Muhammad Ali's troops convinced the Porte of the urgent necessity of new reforms. On November 3, 1839, 4 months after the Battle of Netzib and Mahmud II's death, the new Sultan, Abdülmecid, 1839–61, called a meeting of higher dignitaries, foreign diplomats and representatives of the merchant class at his Palace of Roses, Gulhan. At this meeting the contents of the manifesto called Hadi Sharif Gulhain were read out. The manifesto enunciated the program of reforms known as the Tanzimat al-Khairiyya, charity reforms, from which the whole reformative period in the history of the Ottoman Empire received the name Tanzimat. The manifesto proclaimed, "The whole world knows that in the first years of the Ottoman Empire the famous laws of the Quran in the empire were respected by all. Therefore, the state grew in strength and grandeur, and all its subjects without exception lived in the highest degree of prosperity. Reforms dictated by the new conditions of economic and social life were portrayed in the manifesto as a return to the old laws and institutions of the Ottoman Empire, to its golden age." The manifesto also noted that for various reasons, in the last 150 years, people have ceased to observe the holy code of laws and the rules proceeding from it, and the former might and prosperity of the empire has declined into weakness and poverty. The manifesto then undertook to extend the blessings of good administration to all the regions of the empire by means of new institutions. The new institutions were to ensure the following: complete safety of life, honor and property of subjects, irrespective of their religion; a correct method of the assessment and collection of taxes; a correct method of military recruitment and reduction of the term of service; the guarantee of personal immunity and property inviolability in the Ottoman Empire, where everyone's life depended on the unrestricted arbitrary powers of the satraps and pashas, was of great significance. By its guarantee of property rights, the Hadi Sharif Gulhain created the conditions for bourgeois accumulation. This guarantee applied to all subjects regardless of their religion. This was especially important, because the bourgeoisie in the empire was mainly of another nationality and belonged to the persecuted Christian religion: Armenia and Greeks in Turkey proper, Armenians and Arab Christians in Syria, Maronites in the Lebanon, Copts in Egypt, and so on. The manifesto specified concrete measures to ensure personal immunity and property inviolability, namely, the introduction of public trials. That is why each defendant will be tried publicly according to our holy law after the investigation, and until the correct verdict has been passed nobody has the right to kill openly another by poison or any other means. Banning of the old practice of confiscating a criminal's property. Each will own all forms of property and will dispose of it freely without hindrance of any kind. Thus, for example, the innocent heirs of the criminal will not be deprived of their legal rights, and the property of the criminal will not be confiscated, and the convening of a consultative legal council to draw up new laws. Fixed tax rates and a fixed budget were introduced into the farming out of taxes, iltizam, and the system of selling government posts, which had led to the same extortionate practices as tax farming, were abolished. Universal military service and regular conscription were instituted. A recruiting law was promulgated, reducing the period of military service to 4 or 5 years and fixing military conscription in the provinces in proportion to the number of the population. The reforms of the first period of the Tanzimat. Despite its moderation and half measures, the Hadi Sharif Gulhain encountered strong opposition among the most reactionary feudal lords, courtiers and religious authorities. Sultan Abdulmajid himself, who had been forced to sign the manifesto, was unable to conceal his disapproval of the projected reforms. He regarded the Tanzimat as a compromise to which he had agreed against his will, and whenever the opportunity offered, did all in his power to hinder its implementation. Most of the contemplated reforms, therefore, even the mildest of them, remained ink on paper, whether they were made law or not. The Tanzimat, however, did have some results. In the first place, an attempt was made to divide functions, to separate civil from military administration and create a new legal procedure. The recruiting law promulgated in 1843 introduced universal military service and reduced its term to 5 years. A radical change was made in the army. The infantry and cavalry were reorganized along French lines and the artillery along German lines. From then on, the Turkish army was composed of 6 corps, 2 of which were stationed on the Balkan Peninsula, 2 in Asia Minor, 1 with its headquarters at Damascus in Syria and Palestine, and 1 with its headquarters at Baghdad in Iraq. In 1840, Sultan Abdulmajid began the work of instituting judicial reforms, which dragged on for many years. The drawing up of a new criminal, trade and civil legislation and the laying of the foundations of a new judicial system continued throughout the period of the Tanzimat. Muhammad Ali himself had made an attempt to regulate tax gathering. In 1838, he had established a fixed salary for the officials, and then abolished several government monopolies which had led to all sorts of abuse. The tax farming system was liquidated in 1840 and the provincial pashas were deprived of the right to gather taxes. This task was handed over to special tax collectors, who came under the control of the Central Finance Department. Actually, this measure was carried out only in the towns. The attempt to abolish the farming out of agricultural taxes fell through, and the powerful tax farmers continued their old practices. The administrative reform, which was linked up with the division of civilian and military authority, clearly defined the duties of the wali, governors, and the kaymakims, who governed the vilayets and sanjaks respectively. They were granted only civil powers and could be removed at any time. The elayets, which had previously been feudal patrimonies of the pashas, were turned into subdivisions of a united state body. The departments of state became specialized. Special consultative organs were attached to the governorships. These were administrative councils, Majlis-i-Daraya, made up of representatives of the bureaucracy, clergy, landlords and merchants. A special official, Defterdar, who was independent of the wali, was entrusted with the collection of taxes and the finances of the vilayet. The Malmudirs or Muhassils, who headed the tax department in the sanjak, were independent of the kaymakim, but dependent on the Defterdar. Greater consideration was given to education during the period of the Tanzimat. A law was issued in 1845 introducing free and compulsory education. Although this law, like many others, remained largely unimplemented, it had favorable results. The collegiate mosques were placed under the control of the state. Secular secondary schools were founded where the pupils studied history, geography and elementary mathematics. Special medical, engineering, law and military schools were established at Istanbul, and in 1847 a Ministry of Education was founded. An attempt was made in 1845 to set up special commissions in each elayet to investigate the causes of the decline in farming. These commissions were to discuss agricultural problems such as the land tax, road building and irrigation. Their activities, however, were doomed to failure since the main cause of the decline in farming, the feudal system, remained untouched. Such were the reforms carried out in the first period of the Tanzimat, 1839–56. They gave greater scope for the development of the local bourgeois elements, but were not enough to change the social system. They did not undermine the feudal mode of production or the feudal state, nor did they create the conditions for the development of a national capitalist industry, for repelling the economic aggression of foreign capital. The reforms gave the bourgeoisie certain personal privileges but did not give it political rights. All the power in the empire remained in the hands of the old bureaucracy. The reforms in Syria and Palestine. After the evacuation of Muhammad Ali's troops, Syria and Palestine again reverted to Turkish rule. The Porte immediately began to normalize the administration of these far-flung provinces. New laws were gradually introduced despite the opposition of the reactionaries. The governors of the elayets in Syria and in other parts of the empire were deprived of military and financial prerogatives. Special financial officials, defterdars and muhassils, who depended directly on the administrative finance, were appointed. But the tax farming system was retained. After the institution of military reforms, a corps of the new regular army, the Arabistan Ordus, was quartered in Syria. This was a regular army under the command of a field marshal, Mushir, who was independent of the civilian authorities, but subordinate to the Ministry of Defense. In 1841, a new territorial division was introduced in Syria. The Pashaliks of Sidon and Tripoli were merged into one elayat and its center was transferred to Beirut. Palestine was divided into a special Sanjak of Jerusalem under the control of the Beirut governor. All these relatively insignificant administrative changes did not affect the core of the feudal system in Syria. However, they deceived the peasants, who regarded them as a promise of liberty. The uprisings against Egyptian rule and the active part played by the Syrians in expelling the Egyptians from Syria and Palestine had given the Syrians more confidence in their strength. On the other hand, the restoration of Turkish rule did not ease the lot of the Syrian people. All this served to create the prerequisites for a new upsurge of the liberation struggle. A series of anti-feudal uprisings took place in Syria, the most serious of which were the Aleppo Uprising of 1850 and the Hawranian Uprising of 1852–53. The liquidation of the Lebanese Principality. The anti-feudal movement was especially strong in the Lebanon. The big Druze feudal lords returned to the Lebanon after the dethronement and banishment of Emir Bashir II in 1840 and began to solicit for the return of their former estates and political privileges. The Maronite peasants offered resistance to the Druzes, on whose lands they had settled during the reign of Emir Bashir II. The ensuing struggle created a tangle of conflicts. The real class differences, complicated by the conflicts between the Druzes and the Maronites, were supplemented by the rivalry between England and France, who backed the opposing religious and political groups. England supported the Druzes and France, the Maronites. In October 1841, the British armed Druze feudal lords instigated a revolt against the Porte's appointee, Emir Qasim, who was Bashir II's cousin. They managed to involve the Druze peasants, who were dependent upon them. The insurgents laid siege to the emir's palace. They broke into the Maronite villages, slaughtered the population, burned homes and seized lands and orchards. The Maronites organized self-defense detachments and at times successfully repulsed the attacks of the Druzes. Several Maronite detachments penetrated into the Druze villages, where they organized pogroms. This mutual extermination continued for 6 weeks. The Druzes finally gained the upper hand and took over the southern Lebanon. The Porte used this as an opportunity to send its troops to the Lebanon. Emir Qasim was deposed, arrested and sent to Istanbul, and the Lebanese Principality was turned into an ordinary Turkish province with the Turkish general, Omar Pasha, as governor. Omar Pasha launched reprisals against the Druze feudal lords, who prevented him from pursuing his centralizing policy. In March 1842, he summoned 8 Druze sheikhs to his castle at Beit ed-Din, arrested them and sent them to Beirut under heavy guard. After their arrest, the Maronite who had fled from the southern Lebanon during the massacre of 1841 returned to their home villages, lands and orchards. The actions of the Turks caused disapproval among the powers that were striving to consolidate their positions in the east. They sharply protested against direct Turkish rule and demanded that the Lebanon's autonomy be restored. France, who supported the Maronites, insisted on the return of Bashir II, Shahab, and, to back up her demand, sent a squadron to Beirut. England again sided with the Druze feudal lords who had fought against the Shahab family. Under pressure from the powers, the Porte held a referendum in the summer of 1842 in the Lebanon. The results showed that the Maronites were in favor of restoring the Lebanese Principality with the Christian governor from the Shahab family. The Druze feudal lords pretended to submit to the Porte and during the referendum voted for direct Turkish rule. However, in October 1842, they again rose in rebellion, demanding the release of the arrested sheikhs and the resignation of Omar Pasha. But they were defeated once again. Omar Pasha crushed the Druze irregulars and burned the ancestral castle of the Jumblat family. In 1843, however, the Porte was finally compelled to relinquish its plans for the direct rule of the Lebanon. Under pressure from the powers, it agreed to hand over the administration of the Lebanon to two Kaymakims from among the local feudal lords. A Christian was appointed Kaymakim over the Maronites and a Druze over the Druzes. The Shahabs were removed for good. This solution only confused matters further in the Lebanon and fanned the flames of discord between the Druzes and the Maronites. A Turkish pasha aptly termed the solution an organized civil war. The Druze Maronite massacre of 1845. There was no uniform religion in the Lebanon. Nearly all the people in the north, in Kesrouan, were Maronites. The majority, in the central part of the Lebanon, Mehran, were also Maronites, but Druze villages were scattered here and there among the others. The peasant population in the southern part, Shuf, was mixed, and consisted of both Druzes and Maronites. The feudal claimants to power in Shuf were Druzes. When functions were divided between two Kaymakims, Kesrouan went to the Maronite Kaymakim and the other regions were declared mixed. A new conflict arose between the Druzes and the Maronites over the mixed regions. The Christians of the mixed regions, anxious to retain their lands, felt they should subordinate directly to a Christian Kaymakim. The Druze feudal lords said there could not be two governors in one district and that the Maronites of the mixed regions of Shuf should submit to the Druze Kaymakim. In the end, in September 1844, they agreed to a compromise suggested by the French Council, which only widened the organized civil war. Two elders, or wakils, one for the Christian and one for the Druzes, were appointed in each of the mixed villages. The Maronites of Shuf were subordinate to the Druze Kaymakim, but could lodge complaints against him through their wakil before the Christian Kaymakim. The Druze sheikhs returned to their former estates immediately after the southern Lebanon had been handed over to the Druze Kaymakim. The Maronite peasants began to prepare for an uprising. This time the religious form of the conflict was soon discarded and the uprising acquired a clearly defined class character. Unlike the uprising in 1840-41, when the Maronite peasants fought under the leadership of the feudal sheikhs and priests, the insurgent detachments were now made up entirely of peasants. The Christians began to form levies with platoon and company commanders, and so on. But not a single sheikh or emir dared command the levies, wrote an eyewitness. A secret committee at Deir el-Kamer, which had branches in all the big settlements of the southern Lebanon, stood at the head of the movement. But the peasants did not fully grasp the class aims of the struggle. Their hatred for the Druze feudal lords extended to all the Druzes in general, thereby antagonizing the Druze peasants and calling forth a wave of Maronite pogroms. An uprising began in May 1845 and spread to all parts of the Lebanon. It was followed by a general slaughter of the Druze peasants, who in return began slaughtering the Maronites. Tens of Druze and Maronite villages were sacked and completely destroyed. The anti-feudal character of the movement forced the Turkish authorities to change their policy. Although in the struggle for the centralization of the empire, the Porte had come out against the Druze feudal lords, who wanted to retain their former political rights, it continued to uphold the interests of the feudal class as a whole. In 1841 and 1842, the Porte had put down the mutinies of the Druze sheikhs against the unity of the empire, but in 1845, it helped the same Druze sheikhs suppress an uprising of the Maronite peasants against the feudal system. With the help of the Turkish forces, the Druzes emerged triumphant. The Druze Kaymakim continued to govern the southern Lebanon and the estates remained in the hands of the Druze sheikhs. The uprising then spread to the northern Lebanon, where the Maronite peasants rose in rebellion against the bishops and nobles of their own sect. By the autumn of 1845, the Turkish troops had subdued and disarmed the Lebanon. A new administrative regime was organized with the help of the foreign consuls. While preserving a system of dual control, 2 kingmakims for the whole area and 2 wakils for each village, the foreign consuls demanded the formation of a council to assist each kingmakim. The council was to have judicial functions and also the right of control over the collection and assessment of taxes. The council was to be made up of 10 members, 2 Maronites, 2 Druzes, 2 Sunnites, 2 Greek Orthodox and 2 Melkites, Greek Uniates. This, however, did not do away with the main conflict between the peasants and the feudal lords. At the same time, it deepened religious discord, caused fresh strife between different religious groups, and gave the foreign powers a permanent excuse for meddling in Syria's internal affairs.